Corruption has infected Guyana, the Caribbean, and countries all across the world. Can we cure corruption? Or it's just merely that we will have to curb it? How do we do this? And what damage is corruption doing to societies and people across the world? Stay tuned. Carib Nation is up next. We have been having news from Latin America and the Caribbean and in the United States about corruption. And it seems that we can't deal with it effectively. Even here at the university where I teach a course entitled Government and Political Corruption. And the students are researching papers. How is the government of country X effectively implementing policies to curb corruption and to ensure good governance? Carib Nation today is discussing this subject in a conversation with Aline Piva, a native of Brazil, and also a political analyst of the Council of Hemispheric Affairs, and also a journalist with a blog called Knockout. I also have with me Mr. Floyd Haynes, a professor at the University of District of Columbia, who is a CPA. He has a company, he's in the private sector also, and he studied at Harvard and Oxford. So welcome to the Carib Nation program.
Thank you, Paul.
Aline, I will start with you. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your country of birth?
So, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I am originally from Brazil, but I have been living here in DC for almost 4 years now. And I have been, and it's a very interesting time to be here in DC and to work on the Council of Hemispheric Affairs, because as you know, Brazil just underway a political coup against the Workers' Party. And one of the main what people think about that is that Dilma Rousseff was impeached because she was corrupted. That's not the history, that's not the whole history, and trying to understand why and how corruption played an important role in undermining, you know, the progressive government of the Workers' Party and the progressive policies that were being implemented in the country. I think it's a very interesting moment for us to do this discussion.
Very good, and I'll get back to it because Brazilians have a history of dealing with corruption. Many of presidents have gone to jail, and Brazil has emerged as, well, at least one private sector company as a corruptor of almost 22 countries in Latin America. And also, many of your presidents are on the inquiry about the car wash issue and so. So, Mr. Haynes, can you tell us a little bit about corruption? Where you from and corruption of your country? Is there a similar problem like Brazil? How is it? What is the temperature in your country?
Well, Guyana historically is, well, first let me say corruption exists everywhere.
True.
However, in developing countries, it tends to be more systemic. That is, it affects the entire system. And as a result of that, it has a crippling effect on the economic development of developing countries. Now, in my country, Guyana has been rife with corruption for quite some time. We had administration after administration coming into power with promises that the first thing they're going to do is to stamp out corruption. And it hasn't worked. All they have done is really continue. So corruption has been around, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I don't think there's anything we can do to eliminate corruption, but I think there's a lot we can do to mitigate it and reduce corruption.
Prevention.
Prevention.
Is like the flu, but we still get it eventually.
Yeah.
Ms. Piva, there are two issues that has hit the headlines and people in America and around the world know about. And one is the role of the Odebrecht, it's called the Odebrecht scandal. Can you explain to our audience what that scandal was about? How did it manifest itself and how it impacted in Latin America?
So this was a corruption scandal when they found out that some people within state companies, especially in Petrobras, but in many others, such as Furnas, and it was a broad scheme where some people within those state companies, state-owned companies, they were giving
Petrobras is the oil company of Brazil.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. So they were giving contracts to those conglomerates, to those private conglomerates, in exchange of some, briberies and things like that. The thing is, it's something that, and what the media and everywhere makes it look like is that it's something new. But the car wash investigation itself showed that the corruption...
By the way, why do they call it car wash? I
car
found
wash.
that very curious.
It is curious because the whole investigation started in this gas station in Brasilia, nearby the Congress, where they did the money laundering. And that investigation that started as an investigation as money laundering in a car wash, got huge. Yeah,
That's hilarious.
It is. And it got, to this whole new investigation that
I have to pay
got
attention now
broader.
to car washes when I take my car.
Yeah, true.
You never know what's going on inside.
Especially if they are nearby the government.
Odebrecht is a company in Brazil that did construction projects, went around Latin America, and all the projects that different countries had. They gave money to the politicians, they overestimated the cost of projects, and then they took some of that money and gave it to the politicians. Isn't that a fact?
That would be the broad spectrum of it. And that highlights how corruption is more related to the private sector than the government. I mean, of course, government people received briberies and money and everything, but it does not compare to the amount of money that was funneled to channel to the private sector in that corruption scheme.
And you have a statistic about this. What is the statistic?
There is this recent study, I forgot who, I think it was Public Transparency.
Yeah, Transparency International.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, thank you. And they showed that only 3% of the corruption in the global south of the money that is stole from the people comes from the government. All the rest is done by the private sector, and not private sector in the global south, but in main centers such as London, such as here at the Wall Street. So it is a bit of an interesting to understand how it's used to undermine governments in the global south and to undermine our projects of sovereignty, of construction, because here there is this understanding that everything, our countries in the global south, they are underdeveloped because of corruption. And that is not true.
So
there is a lot to it more.
So there are those who talk about corruption and the underdevelopment of Latin America, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Floyd, looking at it the way Aline has presented it, so we need not only a local response and a national response, we need a global response. Now you are CPA. Now a lot of the skullduggery that goes on with corruption are guys like you who fix accounts. There is even a movie called The Accountant.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about how globally your profession as CPAs, you could be part of the cure rather than part of the solution.
Well, I think you have to set up...
I mean, part of the cure rather than the
Yeah.
problem. Yeah, sorry.
Well, I think you have to set up systems of checks and balances. But it doesn't stop there. You see, a system is made up of people. And as long as you have people operating those systems that are corrupt, the system will be corrupt. So you have to set up independent institutions that are separate and apart from government. Here in the States, we have something called the Inspector General's Office.
Yes. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, the IG office is sort of a watchdog office, if you may, on federal agencies. Each agency has an Inspector General's office that is responsible for oversight. They look for things like bribery, corruption, fraud, and those kinds of things. But the thing to note about it, that office is independent of the agency that it watches over. And so that agency doesn't have any jurisdiction. And because of that independence, they're allowed to do their work in a much more effective way. One of the things we can do in developing countries is to set up those kinds of things. I also think there has to be more pressure on international companies by their governments to punish companies that offer bribes to officials in developing countries. We have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It has to be a lot more rigorous, and other countries should have those kinds of laws as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
And but the problem with that is that what we see, and I'm talking the example of Brazil because it's the one that I have more, contact with. But what we see is that kind of international laws, they are being used and instrumentalized to undermine the sovereignty of the countries. So you use the corruption excuse, which is a legitimate one. The struggle against corruption is a legitimate one. But then use it to undermine the sovereignty of the countries, to actually raise the scope of the interventionism, especially U.S. interventionism in development countries.
Okay, and one of the things that I mentioned was that the Organization of American States is holding a conference on democratic governance against corruption in April. And it seems to me there is a cloud over the OAS because Almagro, who is the Secretary General, had sent out Juan Jimenez, who had a history in Peru of bringing down Fujimori by exposing his corruption, he had sent him into Honduras to work with an anti-corruption mechanism. And then later he withdrew this support because the Honduras government pressured the OAS. Do you have any comment to make on that?
Well, I think...
Because here we have an international organism in the Americas that ideally we can appeal to address corruption. And now we're having a contradiction. And the other point is they are holding the conference in April in Peru. And the president of Peru has just had to resign because of corruption.
Exactly. I think that's an amazing example of exactly this, of how corruption is instrumentalized to achieve certain, aims, certain goals. So this, when you talk about the OAS, we are talking about an organism that, at the same time that fiercely attacks Venezuela, where we have a democratically elected government, goes to Honduras and legitimate, a fraudulent government.
There were one coup and
one coup, then
electoral malpractices.
And two frauded elections, right? So what is the legitimacy of a conference that is held by such organization?
So you have doubts about the legitimacy of the conference?
Of course.
And that they will not make a contribution to dealing with this problem?
If they wanted to make a contribution, they would hold a truly democratic summit and not use it as a political fact against neighbors in Latin America.
Well, 2018 is going to be the year in Latin America where over 300 million people would be voting for new governments. And what is ironic is that most of the candidates that are winning in the polls are people on anti-corruption platforms. What explains this? Because a lot of them, when they come to power, we are back on a treadmill. They are doing the corruption all over again. How? So it seems to me that democratic elections are not effective instruments to end corrupt leaders. How do we deal with that?
It's
a
training,
dilemma.
Paul. It's
a dilemma.
It's very systemic. A big part of corruption, particularly in developing countries, I think, is a sense on the part of the people that the system isn't fair, the playing field isn't level, and that in developed countries there is a sense that if you do your thing, you work hard, you play by the rules, you at least could do okay. You could transition from one economic class to the next. There isn't that sense in developing countries, and I can talk about my own country, Guyana. Let me give you a real example. If you were to name the 10 richest people in America today, 50 years ago, nobody would have heard of any of them. If I were to name the 10 richest people in Guyana today, leaving aside the nouveau riche, they were the same people that were the leading families 50 years ago.
In Brazil, too.
And so because there is this sense that you can't move through the system, it's an incentive for people to just beat the system, be corrupt.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of what drives the culture of corruption.
I'm very concerned about verifiable, free and fair elections because I give leadership fighting for it in Guyana and dedicated a significant part of my life on it. And I really believe in democracy and that the people have the right to elect and recall a government of their choice in a verifiable, free and fair election. I'm very concerned about the corruption that was being practiced by Cambridge Analytica. You all might have heard about that.
Yeah.
Cambridge Analytica has a mother company, Strategic Communication Laboratories. Now these folks collected data from Facebook, which is a private, I'm on Facebook, and I didn't give them no authority to use my information, millions of people's information, and use it to gerrymander people's data and to win elections. And they claim that they swayed many elections, including America in 2016. So it's not only the Russian interventions. And they said they did 100 campaigns across the world in 5 continents, 200 elections. They did smear campaigns. They did honey traps. They claim that, and this is so scary, in Kenya, the current president Kenyatta, they rebranded his party twice. They wrote his manifesto. Can you believe that? I ran for elections in Guyana, and myself and the grassroots wrote our manifesto. It would be unimaginable that somebody from a company in Washington or London is writing the manifesto for your political party. It's incredible. That's a state in which we have then degenerated in terms of, and leadership has become corrupt. Research analysis, messaging. They wrote all the speeches for the presidential candidate. This is incredible. And they have done it in Nigeria, Mexico, Brazil, India, Malaysia.
You know, Paul, a big part of that is, listen, we have to behave, we in the developing world have got to start behaving like we are developed, like we are independent. We invite these experts. You could fly around Latin America and the Caribbean and look at all the experts that are advising those governments. We bring them to the table. They come from London, Canada, Europe, America, all the experts are coming to the developing country. And they're there because there are opportunities for them to exploit those countries. We have to start relying on our own experts and our own people.
And more than that, I think that illustrates pretty well what we were saying earlier about why the idea of the global south being corrupted is something that is in the interest of private companies and private interests. So when we have a company based in London meddling with elections in Brazil, and what we see now is a government that is effectively, dismantling all the little advancements we had in fighting corruption, you understand that there is something there that goes beyond what we can perceive in the surface.
So democracy right now in the world is in a state of crisis because of all these factors. We have drug money, we have corruption of various levels. Now, another point that is very important, because we have to look to hope. We have to have hope. Many people are saying on all the issues we look at that increasingly we have to look for leadership independent of government and the private sector. Now, I have noticed in Brazil that the people of Brazil, the people of Honduras, the people of Guatemala, and the people across the world have been mobilizing against corruption. Were it not for their mobilization, we might not have had this issue even being addressed. So can you give me a little insight into the civil society work in Brazil that has dealt with this issue? It was impressive when we look at it on television.
That is true that we had a mobilization against corruption, but the thing is that there is this whole, I'm not quite sure if that's the exactly word, but it's kind of a moralism about corruption. So in Brazil, for example, you see that, and that moralism is something very, very bad when you are going to raise this issue and in a kind of, systemic way and try to understand why corruption exists and how to fight back. Because when you perceive this, when you perceive corruption from a moral point of view, you get a lot of space to manipulate the feelings. What happened in Brazil is that that feeling, which is a legitimate one, we need to fight back corruption, but you change that perception into this, to criminalize certain people, to criminalize certain parties, and then what we see is that the level of when people, when you get like, when you see it's something that is related to the Workers' Party, people get, anger and go to the streets and everything. When we are talking about mainstream parties, you don't see the same level of reaction because a lot of that reaction is manipulated by the media. And in that process, in kind of a comparative way of what happened here in the struggle against terrorism and, quote unquote, is that people is willing to give up basic rights and to, entail a criminalization and a political persecution against certain people and against certain parties, and you don't address the systemic issue. You don't address the root of the problem.
I agree with you that it is systemic, and corruption is a major factor, but there are many major factors depending on which society we are dealing with. Here in America, the media is playing a very important role in addressing the issue of political corruption. There's been a long campaign about campaign finance. In Guyana, I saw Christopher Ram, who is an accountant in Guyana and a civil rights leader. He has been saying that unless there's legislation about financing election campaigns, that people should boycott the elections.
I want to say something about Guyana. The problem with Guyana is that we politicize everything, and we politicize corruption. And so while we have civil society groups that are vigilant and vocal, it depends on who's in power. And what I find, you don't have consistency, where the same group that is against your government should be against the other government if you lose this power and the other government comes to power. But what you find are groups that are against governments, not against corruption.
Exactly.
So if I'm against your government, I will be opposed to corruption when you do it. But when my group gets into power, I go quiet.
Exactly.
And that kind of lack of consistency
Guyana,
in fighting
that
corruption
is a reality,
is a
and
major
that
problem.
gets compounded. You are correct when you have a polarized ethnic society. In Guyana, we have the Indo-Guyanese and the Afro-Guyanese and other Guyanese.
But it's more than that.
But when the Indo-Guyanese elite was in power, there wasn't much. The people turned their eyes to the corruption.
Precisely.
And now that the other government has come, they're looking at it, but then these are practicing the same thing. And the Afros probably are quiet about it. So you are right about that it becomes opposition politics rather than fighting corruption.
Exactly.
So this has been a very useful conversation. Corruption is going to continue to be an issue on the agenda of countries all over the world since the beginning of times. We discuss it philosophically, whether it has to do with the nature of humans. We can go back to Rousseau and Locke and Hobbes about the nature of the human being. But we have been able, over the centuries, and particularly in democratic societies, to build institutions. And I think the emphasis should be to build institutions and don't allow, in recent times, as we have seen, that technology invade the democratic process by manipulating data and information and indoctrinating people almost like dictatorial societies. So there is hope that we will be dealing with corruption because we have been witnessing Sarkozy in France, the leader of Peru had to resign, Brazil, many government leaders have been pulled up on the carpet, and all over the world, in America and all over the world, people are addressing the issue of corruption. I think that we have to stay informed, we have to stay conscious, and as our guests have said, we have to keep fighting corruption and not be distracted by opposition politics, but to seriously address the systemic issues of corruption and come up with instruments, mechanisms, and institutions that can effectively curb corruption significantly in all our countries. Until next time, I'm Paul Nehru, Tennessee, for Paris Nation.